The wagon creaked to a halt at the edge of Fort Remington like a dying animal giving its final breath. Travelers disembarked with purpose, settlers clutching land deeds, soldiers reporting for duty, traders hauling goods for barter. But one woman remained motionless on the wooden bench, her vacant eyes reflecting nothing of the bustling frontier around her. White bandages wrapped her head like a crown of thorns, bloodstains seeping through despite the doctor's careful work. Winter bit hard at the edges of Dakota Territory in 1876. Snowdrifts piled against the fort's walls, and icicles hung like transparent. Daggers from every rooftop. The woman's breath clouded before her, but she made no move to pull her thin woolen blanket closer. The wagon master approached cautiously, hat in hand. "Ma'am, we've arrived," he said, his voice gentler than it had been throughout the grueling 3-week journey. When she didn't respond, he sighed. "The army surgeon says you need to go to the infirmary now. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." She turned slowly, as if the movement caused her pain. Perhaps it did. The wound beneath those bandages had nearly killed her when the soldiers found her half frozen in a creek bed 30 miles west. No identification, no memory, just blood-matted hair and eyes that seemed to have witnessed horrors they couldn't process. "I don't know where to go," she whispered, her voice cracked like parched earth. Something in her tone made the wagon master step back. It wasn't merely confusion, it was emptiness, as if her soul had been hollowed out and left to echo. "The doctor will help you," he said, though his eyes betrayed doubt. Fort Remington was no place for broken things, especially not in winter. Especially not now, with tensions rising between settlers and the Sioux. She allowed herself to be led through the fort's main gate, acutely aware of the stares that followed. Women pulled children closer as she passed. Men's hands drifted instinctively toward weapons. She couldn't have known that rumors had preceded her, whispers of the only survivor from a massacre at Copper Creek, a woman found delirious and speaking in tongues, clutching a bloodied knife that matched no wounds on her body. Fort Remington consisted of 24 wooden structures arranged in military precision around a central parade ground. The infirmary occupied the northwestern corner, a single-story building with a red cross crudely painted on its door. Inside, cots lined the walls, most empty save for 2 that held soldiers suffering from frostbite. Dr. Marcus Holloway barely looked up when she entered. "Put her in the back," he instructed the wagon master, gesturing toward a curtained alcove. "I'll examine her shortly." The wagon master hesitated. "Will she be staying here?" "Until Colonel Patterson decides what to do with her." Holloway's tone suggested he had voiced protests about this arrangement and been overruled. Alone behind the curtain, she sat perfectly still on the edge of the cot. Her fingers, long and pale, with nails bitten to the quick, traced the rough wool of the army blanket. The sensation anchored her, kept her from floating away into the void where her memories should have been. Dr. Holloway appeared minutes later, his spectacles perched on a nose that had been broken at least once. He was younger than his voice suggested, perhaps 30, with prematurely receding hair and eyes that had seen too much frontier medicine. "I need to check your wound," he said, approaching cautiously. She remained motionless as he unwound the bandages, revealing a 6-inch gash that curved from her temple into her hairline. "The stitches are holding. No signs of infection. That's something at least." She didn't respond. "Do you remember anything yet?" he asked, applying a foul-smelling salve to the wound. "Your name, where you're from." She closed her eyes. There were flashes, fragments that made no sense. Snow falling through trees, a burning cabin, the sound of hoofbeats, a silver hairbrush with the initials EM engraved on the handle, blood on her hands, but whose blood? "Elizabeth," she whispered, the name emerging from nowhere. "Maybe Elizabeth." Holloway. nodded encouragingly. Good, that's a start. Elizabeth, what? She shook her head slightly, immediately regretting the movement as pain splintered behind her eyes. Rest now, he said, rewrapping her head with clean bandages. Colonel Patterson will want to speak with you tomorrow. That night, the temperature plummeted further. Wind howled through the gaps in the infirmary walls, and Elizabeth, if that was truly her name, lay awake, listening to the sounds of a frontier outpost settling into uneasy slumber. Somewhere a sentry called the hour. In the distance, wolves answered. Sleep came in fragments, broken by nightmares she couldn't remember upon waking. Each time she jolted upright, heart pounding, hands reaching for something or someone. No. Longer there, morning brought weak sunlight and unwelcome visitors. Colonel Thaddeus Patterson entered without knocking, his adjutant and the fort's Indian agent trailing behind. The colonel was a man whose face seemed permanently arranged in expressions of disappointment, with his posting, his men, and now, apparently with her. "Ma'am," he began without preamble, "I need answers." She stared at him, uncomprehending. 3 families were massacred at Copper Creek. 17 souls lost in the worst Indian attack this territory has seen in 2 years. "You're the only survivor, and I need to know what you saw." Elizabeth's hands began to tremble. "I don't remember." "Try harder," Patterson insisted, his voice sharp as a blade. "Were they Sioux? Cheyenne? How many warriors? Did you recognize any of them?" Each question struck like physical blows. Her breathing quickened, vision narrowing to a tunnel. I can't, Colonel," Dr. Holloway interrupted, stepping between them. "This woman suffered severe head trauma. Her memory may never fully return, and pressure will only worsen her condition." Patterson's jaw tightened. "Doctor, I remind you that we have settlers demanding protection and Washington demanding explanations. I need information, not excuses." "Then I suggest you look elsewhere," Holloway replied, his professional demeanor barely masking his anger. "This woman can't help you." The colonel studied Elizabeth for a long moment. 3 days, he finally said. "I'll give her 3 days to recover enough to make a statement. After that, she'll be transported to Bismarck on the next supply wagon." After they left, Elizabeth turned to Holloway. "What happens in Bismarck?" His hesitation told her everything. "There's an asylum there for the insane," she whispered. "For those who need specialized care," he corrected gently, though his eyes betrayed him. That afternoon a storm descended from the north, bringing snow that fell in sheets rather than flakes. The fort battened down, guards doubling at their posts despite the weather. Tension thickened the air. Elizabeth could feel it even through the infirmary walls. Something was brewing beyond the weather. The doctor brought her a simple meal of beans and salt pork, along with a cup of coffee that tasted of chicory. "The colonel is wrong to push you," he said as she ate. "Traumatic memories can't be forced." "But what if they're right?" she asked, voicing the fear that had been growing since she first awoke to find herself among strangers. "What if I saw something important? What if more people die because I can't remember?" Holloway had no answer for that. Night fell early, the storm obscuring any distinction between afternoon and evening. Elizabeth dozed fitfully, waking at every creak and groan of the building straining against the wind. Around midnight she rose, unable to bear the confinement any longer. The infirmary was dark, save for a single lamp burning low at the duty desk, where an orderly slumbered, head pillowed on his arms. Elizabeth moved silently past him, drawn to the window. Outside, snow swirled in the yellow glow of lanterns marking the fort's perimeter. Guards huddled in whatever shelter they could find, stamping feet and blowing on gloved hands. A movement caught her eye, a shadow detaching itself. From the darkness near the stables, then another and another, not soldiers. The shapes moved too fluidly, too purposefully. She watched, Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. Transfixed as they melted from one pool of darkness to the next, avoiding the lanterns with practiced precision, something stirred in her mind, a memory trying to surface. The same fluid movement, the same deadly purpose. Her heart began to race. She needed to sound an alarm, but her voice froze in her throat. An explosion shattered the night, a gunshot, followed by shouts of alarm. The shadows by the stable scattered, some returning fire, others racing toward the gate. Fort Remington erupted into chaos. The orderly jerked awake, grabbing his rifle from beneath the desk. "Stay here!" he commanded, rushing toward the door. But Elizabeth wasn't listening. Her body was moving of its own accord, responding to some instinct deeper than memory. She slipped out the back door of the infirmary into the howling storm. The cold hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath. She wore only a cotton nightgown beneath the wool blanket clutched around her shoulders. Snow immediately soaked through her stockings, but she pushed forward, away from the gunfire, away from the fort, toward the darkness beyond the walls. She had no plan, no destination, only the certainty that waiting meant death or the asylum. Either way, a life without identity, without purpose. Each step took tremendous effort, the snow already knee-deep in places. She followed the eastern wall, staying in its shadow, invisible against the white backdrop of the storm. A gap appeared, a service entrance left unguarded in the chaos. Elizabeth slipped through, immediately finding herself in open country. The fort's lights receded behind her as she pushed forward, guided only by instinct and the need to put distance. Between herself and Colonel Patterson's questions, time lost meaning. Minutes or hours passed as she struggled through deepening snow, the world reduced to the next step, the next breath fogging before her face. Eventually, the storm began to ease, revealing a night sky scattered with stars and the silhouette of pine-covered hills to the north. She turned toward them, drawn by the promise of shelter among the trees. Her strength was failing. The initial surge of adrenaline had faded, leaving behind bone-deep exhaustion and cold that penetrated to her core. Her feet had gone numb, her fingers stiff and useless as they clutched the now sodden blanket. Still, she pushed forward. The first trees provided little relief, the snow nearly as deep beneath their branches. She stumbled on, her movements becoming clumsy, thoughts growing sluggish. Somewhere in her fading consciousness, she recognized the symptoms of severe hypothermia. Soon she would feel warm, would want to lie down in the snow. And then she would never rise again. A fallen log caught her foot, sending her sprawling face first into the snow. The impact jarred her wounded head, sending lightning bolts of pain through her skull. For a moment, she lay still, the cold seeping into her bones, the temptation to surrender nearly overwhelming. A sound penetrated her haze, the soft crunch of footsteps approaching through snow. A predator, perhaps, drawn by the scent of weakness. She should move, should try to defend herself, but her body refused to respond. Rough hands turned her over. Through half-frozen lashes, she glimpsed a face unlike any she'd seen at the fort. Dark eyes studied her from beneath a fur-lined hood, high cheekbones. Copper skin marked by a jagged scar that ran from left temple to jaw, pulling the corner of his mouth into a permanent half-snarl. He spoke, the words unfamiliar to her ears, Lakota, though she couldn't have known this. When she didn't respond, he switched to heavily accented English. White woman far from fort. Why? She tried to answer, but her lips were too numb to form words. The stranger considered her for a long moment, taking in her bandaged head, her inappropriate clothing, her bare feet now turning blue with cold. "You die here," he stated, not unkindly. Simply a fact. Something in Elizabeth rebelled against this pronouncement. With tremendous effort, she raised her hand, catching the edge of his leather sleeve. Her eyes, though clouded with pain and cold, held his with fierce determination. The hunter grunted softly, reassessing. Strong spirit, stupid journey. Without further comment, he slid his arms beneath her and lifted her as if she weighed nothing. Elizabeth's world tilted, then faded to darkness as consciousness finally fled. She drifted in and out of awareness. Impressions came in fragments, the rhythm of steady movement, the scratch of fur against her cheek, the gradual lessening of cold as her body pressed against something warm and solid. At some point, she heard the nickering of horses and felt herself being lifted again, then placed on what felt like animal hides. When she fully awakened, she lay inside a hide structure, a teepee, though that word didn't exist in whatever remained of her vocabulary. A small fire burned in a central pit, sending smoke curling toward an opening above. Furs and woven blankets created a nest around her. Her wet clothing had been removed, replaced by a soft buckskin dress that smelled of cedar and wood smoke. She struggled to sit up, her head swimming with the effort. A hand pressed firmly against her shoulder, easing her back down. The scarred hunter knelt beside her, his expression unreadable. "Rest," he commanded in that same accented English. "Bad wound, bad cold." Elizabeth studied him now in the firelight. He was younger than she'd initially thought, perhaps 30, with black hair pulled back from his face, revealing the full extent of his scar. It wasn't a clean line, but jagged, as if the wound had been made by something serrated. His eyes weren't black as she'd first perceived, but a dark brown that reflected the firelight like polished amber. "Where am I?" she managed, her voice a dry whisper. "My winter camp," he replied. 3 days from fort." 3 days! She'd been unconscious that long. As if reading her thoughts, he added, "Carried you. Storm bad. Slow journey." The implications sank in slowly. This man, this Sioux hunter, had carried her through a blizzard for 3 days, keeping her alive when she should have frozen to death within hours of leaving the fort. "Why?" she asked, the question encompassing everything. Why save her? Why bring her here? Why care for a stranger who might well be his enemy? He didn't answer immediately, instead reaching for a hide water pouch. Supporting her head, he helped her drink, the water tasting sweeter than any she could remember, though admittedly her memories provided little comparison. When he finally spoke, his words were measured, as if carefully chosen from his limited English. "Dream said find you, not your time to join ancestors." Elizabeth didn't understand. Dreams, ancestors. None of it made sense, and yet she felt no fear. Whatever his reasons, this man had saved her life when he could easily have left. "Her to die, my name," she began, then faltered. "I think my name is Elizabeth." "Elizabeth," he repeated, the syllables awkward on his tongue. He placed his hand over his heart. "Akasheta." Then, perhaps sensing her difficulty with the Lakota name, he added, "Means fighter." "Thank you, Akacheta," she said softly, "for fighting for me." Something flickered across his scarred features. Surprise, perhaps, or recognition. He nodded once, then rose gracefully to tend the fire. As flames leapt higher, Elizabeth fought against the exhaustion still pulling at her. There was something important, something she needed to remember. About the fort, about the shadows she'd seen moving in the night. "The fort," she said suddenly. "There was an attack. The night I left." Akacheta's movements stilled. "Not attack. Rescue." "Rescue?" The word made no sense in context. "Wakanyeja," he said, then clarified. "Children. 2 boys taken by soldiers. We took back." The revelation struck her like a physical blow. Children kidnapped by the army? It contradicted everything Colonel Patterson had implied about savage raids and innocent settlers. But why would this man lie? What would he gain by telling her this when he could have simply left her to die? The colonel said Sioux massacred. Families at Copper Creek, she ventured, watching his reaction closely. Anger flashed across Akecheta's face, transforming the scar from a mark of injury to one of power. Not Lakota way. Kill women, children, no honor. He met her gaze directly. White men lie, make excuse to break treaty, take more land. Elizabeth's head throbbed as conflicting narratives battled for space in her injured mind. She had no reason to trust either version, no memories to confirm or deny either story. And yet, something in Akecheta's fierce denial resonated with her. A truth her body recognized, even if her mind could not. I was found near Copper Creek, she said slowly. The only survivor, they claimed. Akecheta studied her with new intensity. You remember? No. Nothing clear. Just fragments. Snow. Fire. Blood. She pressed her palms against her eyes, as if the pressure might force the memories to coalesce. They think I saw who did it. Colonel wanted me to say it was Sioux, and you ran, Akecheta concluded, not a question. Elizabeth nodded wearily. I couldn't give him what he wanted. They were going to send me to an asylum in 3 days. The hunter considered this information, his expression thoughtful. Finally he spoke again. Rest now. When stronger, we find truth. We. The word caught her by surprise. Dreams brought you to me, he said simply, as if this explained everything. Now responsible. Before she could question him further, exhaustion claimed her once more. As she drifted into sleep, her last conscious thought was that for the first time since awakening in the army wagon, she felt something resembling safety. Outside the teepee, wind whispered through pine branches heavy with snow. Inside, the fire crackled and popped, sending shadows dancing across hide walls. And somewhere on the borders of consciousness and oblivion, Elizabeth dreamed of a silver hairbrush, bloodied hands, and a burning cabin where the truth of her past lay buried beneath ash and snow. Days melded together in Akecheta's winter camp. Elizabeth's fever broke on the 3rd day, leaving her weak but lucid. The head wound began to heal, angry red edges fading to pink, yet the void where her memories should have been remained stubbornly empty, offering only tantalizing fragments that vanished when examined too closely. Medicine will help, Akecheta announced one morning, placing a steaming clay cup beside her bedding. The liquid inside was dark and bitter-smelling. Elizabeth eyed it suspiciously. What is it? Bark of willow, root of echinacea, head medicine. His English, she had learned, was economical but precise, each word chosen carefully from a vocabulary acquired through years of trading with whites. She sipped cautiously, grimacing at the taste. It's terrible. The corner of his mouth, not affected by his scar, twitched slightly. Good medicine always bitter. Bad taste keeps away weak spirits. This was the closest thing to humor she'd witnessed from him. Elizabeth found herself smiling in response, then sobered as a question that had been forming for days finally crystallized. The fort will be looking for me, she said. Won't they search here? Akecheta shook his head. Wasichu, white soldiers. Avoid these hills in winter. Too many places for ambush. His expression darkened. And after taking back children, they will not follow alone. Need many more soldiers first. But eventually they'll come, she pressed. By then, we be gone. He gestured toward the teepee walls. Winter camp temporary. When snow lessens, move north to summer grounds. Elizabeth absorbed this information with growing unease. North meant further from the fort, from settlements, from any chance of rediscovering her past. Yet the alternative, returning to Colonel Patterson's interrogations and the waiting asylum, was unthinkable. I need to stand up, she decided abruptly. 5 days of lying on furs, being tended like an invalid, had left her muscles weak and her mind restless. Akecheta watched silently as she pushed herself upright, steadying herself with one hand against the ground. Her head swam momentarily, then cleared. The buckskin dress she wore felt strange against her skin, softer than expected, conforming to her movements in ways the stiff cotton of her infirmary gown never had. Her first step was tentative, the second stronger. By the third, she stood tall, taking deep breaths of the smoke-tinged air. "I need to go outside," she declared. "Snow deep, cold still strong. I'll freeze in the fort infirmary or I'll freeze under the Dakota sky. At least out there, I'll have seen something besides hide walls before I die." The fierceness in her voice surprised even her. Akecheta studied her with those unreadable amber eyes, then nodded once. He rose and retrieved a fur-lined cloak from a stack of supplies. "Arms!" he commanded. Elizabeth extended her arms, allowing him to drape the heavy garment over her shoulders. It smelled of wood smoke and pine, the fur collar tickling her cheek. He added moccasins lined with rabbit fur, then pulled back the teepee flap. Sunlight reflecting off snow momentarily blinded her. She blinked rapidly, tears forming at the corners of her eyes. As her vision cleared, she found herself staring at a world transformed by winter. The camp consisted of 3 teepees arranged in a rough semicircle, backed against a rocky outcropping that provided natural shelter from north winds. Tall pines surrounded the clearing, their branches heavy with snow. Smoke curled from the top of each dwelling, dissipating into a sky so deeply blue it seemed almost violet. 2 horses stood in a crude corral built against the rock face, their breath clouding. In the frigid air, beyond them, the land fell away sharply, revealing a panoramic view of rolling hills and valleys stretching toward distant mountains. "Beautiful," Elizabeth breathed, each exhalation creating its own small cloud. "Paha Shappa," Akecheta said, gesturing, "toward the mountains. Black hills, sacred land." Elizabeth took a careful step into the snow, which crunched satisfyingly beneath her moccasins. The cold air filled her lungs, sharp and clean. For the first time since waking in the army wagon, she felt truly alive. A small figure darted between the teepees, a child of perhaps 8 or 9, bundled in furs. The girl stopped abruptly upon seeing Elizabeth, dark eyes widening with curiosity. "Winona!" Akecheta called. "Kuwa!" The child approached cautiously, studying Elizabeth with undisguised fascination. Akecheta spoke to her in Lakota, gesturing. Between them, the girl nodded solemnly. "My sister's daughter," he explained to Elizabeth. "Mother died of white man's coughing sickness 2 winters past." Elizabeth knelt carefully, bringing herself to the child's level. "Hello, Winona," she said softly. The girl's serious expression broke into a shy smile. She reached out tentatively, touching Elizabeth's hair where it spilled from beneath her bandages. "Z," she said, looking questioningly at her uncle. "Yellow," Akecheta translated. "She has not seen hair like sun before." Another woman emerged from the largest teepee, older, her face mapped with lines that spoke of both laughter and hardship. Her dark hair, streaked with silver, was braided and wrapped with strips of red cloth. She carried herself with quiet dignity, her gaze sharp as she assessed Elizabeth. "My mother," Akecheta said. "Wicopee Star Woman." The older woman approached, speaking rapidly in Lakota. Her son answered briefly. She turned to Elizabeth, studying her with keen intelligence. "You welcome here," she said in halting English. "Dreams showed my son. Important." Elizabeth inclined, her head respectfully. "Thank you for your hospitality." Star Woman nodded, then gestured toward the largest teepee. "Come, eat." The interior of the main dwelling was similar to Akecheta's, though larger and filled with evidence of longer habitation. Woven blankets in vibrant patterns hung from the walls. Baskets containing dried herbs, berries, and other provisions lined one section. A cooking fire burned in the center, a pot suspended above it, emitting savory aromas that made Elizabeth's stomach growl audibly. They sat in a circle around the fire, Elizabeth, Akacheta, his mother, and little Winona. Star Woman ladled a thick stew into wooden bowls, passing them around with pieces of flat bread. Elizabeth ate slowly, savoring flavors both familiar and strange. Venison, wild onions, something earthy and rich that might have been mushrooms. "Good?" Star Woman asked, watching her carefully. "Very good," Elizabeth confirmed. "Thank you." The older woman seemed pleased by this response. She spoke to her son in Lakota, gesturing toward Elizabeth's head wound. Akacheta translated. "Mother says hair will grow back where they shaved for stitches. Says you have strong spirit to survive such wound." Elizabeth touched the bandages self-consciously. She hadn't realized part of her hair had been shaved, hadn't seen her reflection since before the injury. "How bad is it?" she asked. Star Woman rose and retrieved a small object wrapped in soft leather. Unwrapping it revealed a hand mirror, not crude trade goods, but fine silver with an ornate handle. Elizabeth accepted it cautiously, angling it to see her reflection. A stranger stared back, hollow cheeks, chapped lips, skin pale as moonlight, and eyes, green as spring grass, wide with shock and something deeper, something haunted. The left side of her head was indeed partially shaved, revealing neat stitches following a curved path from temple into her hairline. The rest of her hair, blonde, as Winona had noted, hung in tangled waves past her shoulders. "Not recognize?" Akacheta asked, watching her reaction closely. Elizabeth shook her head slowly. "It's like looking at someone else." Star Woman spoke again, her tone gentle despite the harsh sounds of Lakota. "Mother says mirror shows only outside. True self lives in heart." Akacheta paused, considering his next words carefully. "Says maybe better not to remember yet. Some wounds need time." Elizabeth returned the mirror, disturbed by the hollow-eyed woman she'd seen. What had happened to create such emptiness? What memories lurked beneath the injured surface of her mind? And was Star Woman right? Was forgetting, at least temporarily, a mercy rather than a curse? After the meal, Elizabeth helped clean the wooden bowls, her movement still slow but steadier. Star Woman showed her how to pack snow into a pot and melt it over the fire for washing water, a precious commodity in winter camp. The simple domestic task soothed Elizabeth's troubled thoughts, giving her hands purpose while her mind wandered. That night, she returned to Akacheta's tipi with a small basket Star Woman had given her, containing a bone comb, a cake of soap that smelled faintly of sage, and a length of soft leather to tie back her hair. Small kindnesses that acknowledged her status as more than just a temporary invalid. "Your mother is very generous," she said, as Akacheta built up the evening fire. "Wikapi Win knows importance of dignity," he replied, "even in hardship." Elizabeth settled on her furs, working the comb carefully through her tangled hair. "Will you tell me about your scar?" she asked suddenly, the question emerging before she could reconsider its boldness. Akacheta's hands stilled momentarily, then resumed feeding small sticks to the growing flames. For a long moment, she thought he might ignore the question entirely. 7. Winters passed, he finally said, his voice lower than usual. "My wife, Kimimilla, Butterfly, and I traveled to trade at Fort. Different fort, not Remington. Fort Benson." He sat back on his heels, firelight dancing across the ridged tissue of his scar. Soldiers drunk, angry about battle at Greasy Grass the summer before. "Greasy Grass?" Elizabeth asked. "White men call it Little Bighorn. Wear yellow hair Custer, and died." He spoke the name with neither pride nor remorse, simply stating historical fact. "Soldiers saw us, wanted revenge." The pieces fell into place without needing elaboration. Drunken soldiers, a Sioux couple, recent defeat still rankling. "They attacked you," she said softly. Akacheta nodded. Took Kimimela. I fought. Got this. He traced the jagged line from temple to jaw. Knife with saw edge, for skinning. Elizabeth's stomach turned. And your wife? His eyes reflected the firelight, turning them almost golden, with restrained fury. Never found her. Searched 3 moons. Nothing. The simple statement contained oceans of grief. Elizabeth set aside her comb, all personal concerns suddenly insignificant. I'm sorry, she whispered. So very sorry. Akacheta met her gaze directly. Now you understand. Why I not trust Fort. Why I not trust white soldiers who say Lakota kills settlers. She nodded slowly. Yes, I understand. And she did. Perhaps more deeply than her conscious mind could articulate. Something in his story resonated within her, striking chords of recognition that sent tremors through the void of her memory. We both carry wounds, he said after a long silence. Mine here. He touched his scar. Yours here. He gestured toward her bandaged head, but deepest wounds invisible. Elizabeth considered these words as the fire crackled between them. You could have left me to die in the snow, she said finally. After what white people did to you, no one would blame you. What kind of man becomes what he hates? Akacheta asked simply. Then he added, Dreams showed woman with hair like sun, said important for both peoples. Cannot ignore such medicine. Before she could question him further about these mysterious dreams, he rose and moved to the teepee entrance. Rest now. Tomorrow begin lessons. Lessons, Elizabeth echoed. If stay with Lakota, must learn Lakota ways. His tone was matter of fact. Winter, harsh teacher. Better learn from me first. With that, he slipped outside, leaving Elizabeth to ponder this new development. She wasn't a prisoner. He'd made that clear from the beginning. She could leave whenever she chose. But to where? With what skills? In what direction? For now, at least, her path lay here, learning to survive in a world as foreign to her as her own forgotten past. Morning brought Akacheta with armfuls of hides and sinew. He dropped them beside her bedding and announced, Today make proper winter. Clothes. Elizabeth examined the materials with trepidation. I don't know how. We'll learn. He gestured to her current dress. That's summer weight. Need layers for deep winter. What followed was a lesson in primitive tailoring that tested both Elizabeth's patience and dexterity. Under Akacheta's surprisingly detailed instruction, she learned to measure using finger widths and arm lengths, to mark cutting lines with charcoal, to punch holes along seams with a bone awl. Her first attempts at stitching were clumsy, fingers still weak from illness and injury. The sinew thread was stubborn, the hide thicker than any fabric she could remember working with. Frustration built until she threw down the half-finished legging with an exasperated cry. I can't do this. Akacheta regarded her calmly. Hands remember. What mind forgets, he said. Try again without thinking. Skeptical but lacking alternatives, Elizabeth picked up the materials once more. This time, she allowed her hands to find their own rhythm, her conscious mind stepping back from the process. To her astonishment, her fingers seemed to know exactly how to twist the sinew, how to angle the bone needle, how to create tight, even stitches that would keep winter winds at bay. See? Akacheta observed. Body remembers. Elizabeth stared at her hands with wonder. What does that mean? That I've done this before? Maybe, or maybe similar work. Fine stitching. He examined her handiwork with approval. Not Lakota woman's hands, but good hands still. By midday, she had completed one legging and started on its match. The physical activity, while tiring, felt purposeful in a way that lying on furs recuperating had not. Each completed stitch represented one small victory over her circumstances, one tiny reclamation of agency in a life that had been reduced to confusion and dependency. Star Woman joined them in the afternoon, bringing Winona and additional materials. The older woman settled beside Elizabeth, silently correcting techniques when needed, demonstrating more complex stitches for reinforcing stress points. Despite the language barrier, a quiet camaraderie developed between them. Winona proved an eager assistant, holding pieces in place or fetching items as needed. The child's bright curiosity and ready smile provided welcome distraction from the monotony of sewing. When Elizabeth completed a particularly difficult seam, Winona clapped, her small hands in approval, prompting a rare smile from Star Woman. "She likes you," Akacheta observed as he worked on his own project, refletching arrows with turkey feathers. Not seen her so happy since before her mother walked to Spirit World. Elizabeth watched the little girl sorting colored porcupine quills. "By size, she's a special child, all children special," he replied. "White man forgot this. Why they take our children to schools far away, cut hair, beat Lakota words from mouths." Anger edged his voice. "Why we fight to keep Winona, why rescue boys from Fort." This reminder of the larger conflicts surrounding them dampened Elizabeth's momentary contentment. She was living with people the U.S. Army considered hostile enemies, people who, according to Colonel Patterson, massacred settlers without mercy. Yet nothing in their behavior matched those accusations. Who was lying? The fort commander with his military authority and official reports? Or this small family struggling to maintain their way of life against overwhelming forces? And where did she fit in this conflict? Was she truly a survivor of an Indian attack, as the army claimed? Or was there another explanation for her presence at Copper Creek, her injured head, her blood-stained hands? Night fell early, as it always did in deep winter. Elizabeth stretched her stiff fingers, admiring the nearly completed set of winter. Garments spread before her, leggings, an overskirt of thick hide, and the beginnings of a fur-lined jacket. Tomorrow they would finish the sleeves and add decorative quill work that was as functional as it was beautiful, creating textured ridges that trapped additional warm air. As she prepared for sleep, Akacheta spoke from across the fire. "Dreams come stronger now," he said unexpectedly. "As head heals." Elizabeth looked up sharply. Have you seen my dreams?" He shook his head. "Only hear sounds, words not Lakota, not English either." "What words?" she asked, pulse quickening. "Strange tongue, like singing almost." He paused, then attempted to recreate the sounds. "Mademoiselle doit partir immédiatement." Her phrase struck Elizabeth like lightning. Something cracked in the wall surrounding her memories, a hairline fracture in an otherwise impenetrable barrier. "French," she whispered. "It's French." Akacheta watched her intently. "You understand these words?" "The lady must leave immediately," she translated, the meaning rising from some deep reservoir of knowledge she hadn't known she possessed. I speak French." The realization left her trembling. Who was she? This woman who spoke French, who knew fine stitching, who now found herself among the Lakota people with a head wound and no memory. "Sleep now," Akacheta said gently, recognizing her distress. "Memories return like spring melt. First small trickles, then rushing water. Too much at once drowns mind." Elizabeth nodded, lying back on her furs. As she drifted towards sleep, one thought circled persistently. The lady must leave immediately. Had someone warned her? Had she been fleeing something or someone when she was injured? And most troubling of all, had she left others behind in her escape? The French phrase unlocked something in Elizabeth's mind. Dreams became more vivid, more coherent, though still fragmented like scattered puzzle pieces. She would wake gasping, clutching at images that dissolved with consciousness. A music box playing a delicate melody, A man's voice, cultured and cold, speaking rapid French. The silver hairbrush, always the hairbrush, its handle engraved with the initials E.M., Elizabeth Moreau, she announced one morning as Akecheta returned from checking his traps. 2 weeks had passed since he'd found her in the snow, and her strength had nearly returned to full capacity. He paused in the teepee entrance, raising an eyebrow in silent question. "My name," she clarified. "I think it's Elizabeth Moreau. The hairbrush I keep dreaming about. It has the initials E.M. Akecheta nodded thoughtfully. "French name. Explains words in dreams. But what was I doing in Dakota territory?" She paced. The small confines of the teepee, frustration evident in every movement. Why can't I remember anything useful? Great Spirit reveals what needed, when needed. He set down his game bag, 2 rabbits and a grouse, and began removing his snow-crusted outer garments. Not always what wanted. Elizabeth had grown accustomed to his philosophical responses, finding unexpected wisdom in them despite her pragmatic instincts. She helped him hang the wet garments near the fire to dry, their movements around each other, now practiced and comfortable. "I need to know what happened at Copper Creek," she said, voicing the thought that had plagued her for days. "If I was there, if I saw something—" "Dangerous knowledge," he warned, beginning to clean the rabbits with practiced efficiency. "Fort wants certain answer. May not like truth if different. I don't care what the fort wants. I need to know who I am." She knelt beside him, taking up a knife to help with the task. Another skill her hands remembered without conscious instruction. "You said we would find the truth together. Did you mean that?" Akecheta studied her for a long moment, his scarred face unreadable. "Yes," he finally said. "When storm passes, we go. See what remains at Copper Creek." Relief washed through her. "Thank you," he grunted in acknowledgement. "Need preparation first." Not safe journey. That afternoon, Star Woman arrived with armloads of dried plants and pouches of powdered substances. Elizabeth had grown to appreciate the older woman's quiet strength and practical wisdom, communicated despite their limited shared vocabulary. "Medicine," Star Woman explained, arranging her supplies near the fire. "Learn." What followed was an intensive lesson in Lakota healing practices. Elizabeth learned which plants reduced fever, which stopped bleeding, which fought infection. Star Woman demonstrated how to make poultices, tinctures and healing teas, knowledge that had sustained her people for generations. "For journey," the older woman said pointedly, ensuring Elizabeth understood this wasn't merely academic instruction. By evening, Elizabeth's head swam with new information. Her fingers were stained with plant juices, and small bundles of prepared medicines lay neatly arranged beside her bedding. Star Woman departed with a gentle touch to Elizabeth's cheek, a maternal gesture that inexplicably brought tears to her eyes. "Your mother is remarkable," she told Akecheta as they shared the rabbit stew he'd prepared. "Survived much," he replied. "Lost husband to war with Crow, lost daughter to white man's disease, still stands strong." Elizabeth considered this. Resilience in light of her own circumstances. "She makes me wonder if I come from strong women too." "Dreams show this," Akecheta said with unexpected certainty. "Strong spirit fights to remember." Later, as fire embers glowed in the darkness, Elizabeth ventured another question. "These dreams you had about me, what exactly did they show?" He was silent so long she thought he might not answer. Finally he spoke, his voice low and measured. "First dream came with winter moon. Saw woman with sun hair, standing between two worlds, white man's world and Lakota world. Blood on hands, but not her blood, not her crime." Second dream showed. Same woman walking dangerous path through shadowlands. Said she carries truth that could bring great war or great peace. Elizabeth absorbed this with growing unease. "And you believe these dreams? Dreams are how Great Spirit speaks to those who listen. He regarded her steadily. When found you in snow, recognized woman from dreams, knew then Wikasa Wakan, holy. Man, spoke true. So you saved me because of these prophecies. The thought troubled her, though she couldn't articulate exactly why. Saved you because needed saving, he corrected firmly. Dreams only showed where to look. She nodded, somewhat reassured. And now, why help me find my memories? Why risk going to Copper Creek? Truth important, for both peoples. He added more wood to the fire, sending sparks spiraling upward. And spirits not grant peace until promise fulfilled. The storm Akacheta had mentioned arrived the next day, bringing winds that howled like tortured spirits and snow that fell so thick it obscured the view between teepees. For 3 days, they remained confined to the small dwelling, venturing out only for absolute necessities. Elizabeth used the time to continue working on her winter garments, adding quillwork decorations that Star Woman had taught her. The intricate patterns required complete concentration, providing welcome distraction from the frustrating fragments of memory that continued to surface without context. Akacheta spent hours maintaining his weapons, a Winchester repeating rifle that he treated with reverence, a bow of Osage orange wood backed with sinew, arrows fletched with turkey feathers, and several knives of varying sizes. Elizabeth watched him work, asking occasional questions that he answered with surprising patience. "Where did you learn English?" she asked on the second day of their confinement. "Government school," he replied, voice tight with old anger. 4 years. Before escaped. They took you from your family, all children taken, cut hair, beat if speak Lakota. His hands continued working methodically despite the painful memories. Said, "Kill Indian, save man." Elizabeth frowned. "That's monstrous," he shrugged slightly. "Learned enemy's language? Useful now?" A faint smile touched his lips. "Also, learned reading. Have books." This surprised her. "Here, in the teepee?" He set aside his work and moved to a parfleche, a rawhide container tucked against the rear wall. From it, he withdrew several books wrapped in oiled cloth for protection. He handed them to Elizabeth with unexpected reverence. She unwrapped them carefully. A collection of Shakespeare's works, a Bible with numerous passages marked. Most surprisingly, a well-worn copy of Les Misérables by Victor Hugo, in French. "You read these?" she asked, running her fingers over the embossed leather cover of the Hugo novel. "Shakespeare Bible, yes. French book, no. Traded for it because—" He hesitated, then continued quietly. "Because reminded of Kimimela. She spoke French, taught by Catholic sisters before we married." Elizabeth opened the novel, scanning the familiar text. Understanding flowed through her as naturally as breathing. She began to read aloud, the French flowing from her tongue as if she'd spoken it all her life. "Your accent," Akacheta said after, listening for several minutes. "Different from Kimimela's, more proper." "Parisian," Elizabeth replied without thinking, then stopped abruptly. "How do I know that?" "Memory returns in strange ways," he observed. "Like Spring Creek finds path of least resistance." The storm finally broke on the 4th day, leaving behind a transformed landscape of sculpted drifts and crystalline beauty. The sun emerged, blindingly bright against the pristine snow. Akacheta declared it time to prepare for their journey to Copper Creek. 3 days' travel, he explained as they packed supplies. "Need snowshoes. Bring both horses." Elizabeth had completed her winter clothing, leggings beneath a buckskin dress, a fur-lined overjacket, mittens stuffed with rabbit fur, and moccasins wrapped with strips of hide for better traction in deep snow. Star Woman inspected each item, making small adjustments and adding additional sinew reinforcement where needed. Winona watched the preparations with obvious distress, finally tugging at Elizabeth's sleeve. "Inanji," she said, using the name she'd given Elizabeth, meaning stands firm. Snee Tehika. Cold. Dangerous. Elizabeth knelt to the child's level. "We'll come back," she promised, though uncertain of the truth of her words. Star Woman placed warm hands on her daughter's shoulders, speaking soft Lakota that seemed to comfort the girl. To Elizabeth, she offered a small leather pouch to wear. Around her neck, protection, she explained in her limited English, from bad spirits, from bad dreams. That night Elizabeth slept fitfully, anticipation and anxiety churning through her dreams. Again, she saw the cabin at Copper Creek, flames licking at its walls. Again, she heard French spoken urgently, though the words remained tantalizingly out of reach. And for the first time, she dreamed of a man with cold eyes and a cruel mouth, reaching for her with hands that promised both luxury and imprisonment. She woke, gasping, sweat cooling on her skin despite the winter chill that had crept into the teepee as the fire burned low. Across the dwelling, Akecheta sat upright, watching her with concern. "Bad dreams," he stated rather than asked. She nodded, drawing her knees to her chest. "Someone was chasing me. Someone I feared." "Husband?" he suggested carefully. "No," she replied with surprising certainty. "Not husband, something worse." Akecheta added wood to the dying fire, coaxing flames back to life. "Dawn soon," he said. "Best start early." They left as first light crept above the eastern horizon. Star Woman and Winona stood watching as Akecheta led the way, Elizabeth following on the second horse. The journey would take them dangerously, close to Fort Remington territory, though Akecheta had plotted a route that avoided main trails and known patrol areas. The first day passed in exhausting silence, broken only by necessary communication about the trail. They rode when possible, led the horses through particularly deep drifts, and stopped only briefly to eat dried meat and melted snow. By nightfall, Elizabeth's muscles ached from the unaccustomed exertion, but she said nothing of discomfort. They made camp in a sheltered ravine, building a small fire that produced minimal smoke. Akecheta constructed a lean-to of pine branches, creating a windbreak that reflected heat from the fire. They ate in companionable silence, too tired for conversation. As Elizabeth settled into her buffalo robe for the night, Akecheta spoke unexpectedly. "Once, at Copper Creek, memories may return suddenly. Be prepared." She turned to look at him across the small fire. "I'm counting on that." "Not all memories good," he warned. "Mind sometimes forgets for reason." "Whatever happened there, I need to know," she insisted. "I need to know if I left people behind, if I'm responsible for something terrible." He nodded slowly. "Understand need for truth. But truth has price." "I'll pay it," she said firmly. Akecheta studied her for a long moment, his scarred face half illuminated by firelight. "Yes," he finally said, "you will." The second day brought them to more dangerous territory, rolling plains where visibility extended for miles, making them vulnerable to detection. They traveled in the shadow of creek beds when possible, using the natural contours of the land for concealment. By midday, Akecheta grew increasingly alert, frequently scanning the horizon with narrowed eyes. Without explanation, he led them into a dense stand of cottonwoods that followed a frozen creek. "Soldiers," he explained tersely, pointing to barely visible tracks in the patchy snow. "Patrol. Recent." Elizabeth felt her heart rate accelerate. "How recent?" "Morning. Moving east." He studied the tracks with the expertise of a lifetime hunter. 4 horses, heavy, armed men. They waited in the trees until Akecheta deemed it safe to continue, losing precious daylight. By the time darkness fell, they had covered less ground than planned, forcing another night on the trail. Their second camp was even more primitive than the first, a hollow scraped beneath low-hanging pine branches, barely large enough for 2 people and no fire. They shared body heat out of necessity, wrapped in buffalo robes and pressed together beneath the shelter of branches. Elizabeth found herself oddly comforted by Akacheta's solid presence, his steady breathing a counterpoint to her racing thoughts. "Tomorrow. We reach Copper Creek," he murmured as they lay in darkness. "What you expect to find?" "Answers," she replied simply. One way or another. The third day dawned cold and clear. They ate quickly and broke camp before full light, anxious to reach their destination. Elizabeth felt a growing tension with each mile, a sense of impending revelation that both attracted and terrified her. By noon, Akacheta raised his hand in the silent signal he'd taught her to mean stop. He dismounted, gesturing for her to do the same, and secured the horses to a fallen log. "Walk from here," he whispered. "Less visible, creek over next rise." Elizabeth nodded, heart pounding so hard she was certain he must hear it. They moved forward cautiously, crouching low as they approached the crest of a small hill. At the top, Akacheta dropped to his stomach, motioning for her to do the same. Together, they crawled the last few feet to peer into the valley beyond. Copper Creek lay below them, a small stream now frozen solid, winding through a modest valley flanked by gentle hills. Near its banks stood the charred remains of 3 cabins, their blackened timbers stark against the snow like accusing fingers pointed at the sky. Elizabeth's breath caught in her throat. Vivid images flashed through her mind, flames consuming. Wooden walls, screams cutting through the night, blood bright against white snow. She pressed her fists against her temples, momentarily overwhelmed by the barrage of fragments. "Breathe," Akacheta advised quietly. "Slow, deep." She followed his instruction, gradually regaining control. "I remember fire," she whispered. "So much fire," he nodded grimly. "Army said Sioux burned cabins, kill everyone. Is that what happened?" "We see." He surveyed the area carefully. "No one here now. Safe to go closer." They descended into the valley, approaching the ruined homestead, with cautious steps. 3 cabins had been arranged in a rough triangle, with what appeared to have been a communal area in the center. Now only charred foundations remained, with occasional walls still standing as blackened skeletons. As they entered the clearing, Elizabeth felt a peculiar sensation, as if walking into a half-remembered dream. Her feet carried her toward the largest cabin without conscious direction. She knew this place, had been here before. "This one," she said, stopping before the ruins. "I was here." Akacheta followed silently, his hand resting near his knife, a precaution against dangers both seen and unseen. Elizabeth moved through the wreckage slowly, each step triggering flashes of memory. A table that once stood here, set with fine china incongruous in the frontier setting. A settee imported from St. Louis positioned there, facing a fireplace now collapsed into rubble. And there, a small side room with a door that once had a lock on the outside. She froze, staring at the space where that door had been. "I was kept here," she whispered, the realization rising from some deep recess of memory. "Not allowed to leave." Akacheta's expression darkened. "Prisoner?" "Yes." The word emerged with absolute certainty, but not of Indians, of him. Who? Elizabeth turned slowly, surveying the ruins with new understanding. "Etienne Moreau, my cousin. He brought me here from New Orleans after my parents died. Said it was for my own good, for my protection." Her voice hardened. He lied. The memories were returning now in a flood, painful, clarifying, and undeniable. He wanted my inheritance, needed me to sign papers, kept me drugged, confused. When I refused, she touched her scarred temple. He became violent. Akacheta listened silently, allowing her to piece together her fragmented past without interruption. "There were others here," she continued. "A family in that cabin, the Wilsons, and over there the Harrises, tenant farmers working Etienne's land." Her breathing quickened. They were kind to me. Mrs. Wilson smuggled notes to the fort. Harris tried to help me escape once. She moved to the center of the clearing, turning slowly as the full horror of what happened crystallized in her mind. The night of the fire. Etienne discovered they were helping me. He was furious. I heard shouting, then gunshots. Her eyes filled with tears. He killed them. All of them. For helping me. Not Sioux attack, Akecheta said grimly. White man killed own people. Elizabeth nodded, the weight of truth heavy on her shoulders. He set the fires to cover his crime, planned to blame Indians. She looked at Akecheta with dawning horror. He's still out there. He'll be looking for me, the only witness. How you escape? He asked. How survive? She closed her eyes, concentrating on the final missing pieces. Harris had a gun hidden. I found it while he was dealing with the Wilsons. When he came for me. Her hand moved unconsciously to her wounded temple. We struggled. The gun went off. I thought I killed him, but I must have only wounded him. The implications hung in the frigid air between them. If Etienne Moreau had survived, he would have been the one to report the Indian attack to Fort Remington. He would know Elizabeth had escaped, and he would do anything to find her, the only person who could expose his monstrous crimes. Elizabeth stood amid the charred remains of her prison, fragments of memory coalescing into a terrible whole. Snowflakes began to fall around them, delicate and indifferent to the horrors this land had witnessed. We need to leave, Akecheta said urgently, scanning the ridgeline. Not safe here. She nodded, but couldn't resist one final survey of the ruins. Something caught her eye, a glint of metal beneath half-burned floorboards. She knelt, brushing away ash and splinters to reveal a small object that made her breath catch, the silver hairbrush. Somehow it had survived the inferno, its handle. Tarnished but intact, the initials EM clearly visible. This was my mother's, she whispered, cradling it like a sacred relic. The only thing I brought from New Orleans. Akecheta watched her tuck it into her pouch without comment, but his expression softened momentarily. Even he, who owned so little, understood the power of such connections to the past. They retreated up the hill to where the horses waited, moving carefully to minimize tracks in the fresh snow. Elizabeth's mind raced with implications of what she'd remembered. The fort thinks I witnessed a Sioux massacre, she said as they mounted. But it was Etienne who killed those families. Fort believes what convenient, Akecheta replied grimly. White man's word against Indians. No contest. I have to tell them the truth, she insisted. Clear your people of blame. Akecheta's laugh held no humor. You think they listen? White woman lives with savages, says white man, not Indians, killed settlers. He shook his head. They call you mad. Send to asylum faster. The brutal logic of his assessment silenced her. Who would believe her story? A traumatized woman with a head injury, living among the very people accused of the killings. Her word against that of a presumably respectable businessman. Even to her own ears, the truth sounded fantastical. They rode in tense silence, taking a different route than their approach. Akecheta led them southwest through increasingly rugged terrain, away from the fort, but also away from the winter camp. Where are we going? Elizabeth finally asked as the short winter day began fading to dusk. Trading post, he replied. Crooked Oak. Need information. What kind of information? Whether cousin still hunts you. Whether soldiers prepare war against my people because of his lies. His jaw tightened beneath his scar. Need to know size of storm coming. They made camp that night in a rocky overhang that provided shelter from both weather and unfriendly eyes. Akecheta built a small fire, careful to use only dry wood that would produce minimal smoke. The dancing flames cast shifting shadows across his scarred face as he studied a rough map drawn on a piece of hide. Crooked Oak. Here, he indicated, a point well south of their current position. 2 days, if weather holds. Elizabeth huddled closer to the fire, the enormity of her recovered memories leaving her chilled beyond what physical warmth could address. Who runs this trading post? Will they report us? Nathan Two Bears, half Lakota, half white, trusts neither side completely. A hint of something like affection crossed Akacheta's face. Old friend, fought together against Crow many winters past, and he'll help us? For right price. He tucked the map away. Always help for right price. Morning brought clearer skies and difficult terrain. They traversed narrow ravines and frozen streams, always keeping to natural features that would aid their passage. By midday, Elizabeth noticed Akacheta growing increasingly vigilant, frequently doubling back to check their trail or stopping to study the horizon with narrowed eyes. "Someone follows?" she asked during one such pause. He nodded curtly. 2 riders, maybe 3, keeping distance. Fear coiled in her stomach. "Etienne?" "Not soldiers," he replied. "Move too careful, hide tracks." He adjusted his rifle, ensuring it was accessible. "Bad men, bounty hunters maybe." Bounty? The word struck her like a physical blow. Etienne must have put a price on my head. Or mine, Akacheta added darkly. Many whites pay good money for Sioux scalps, even in peacetime. This brutal possibility had never occurred to Elizabeth. She'd been focused on her own peril, forgetting that her companion lived under constant threat simply by virtue of his heritage. They pushed the horses harder that afternoon, using every trick Akacheta knew to obscure their trail. Crossing streams, backtracking, riding on rocky ground that held no prints. By nightfall he seemed marginally more satisfied, though he insisted they continue another hour by moonlight before making camp. That night they risked no fire. They ate cold pemmican and slept in shifts, one always awake and watchful. During her watch, Elizabeth found herself studying Akacheta's sleeping form. The lines of his face softened slightly in repose, though never completely unguarded. Even in sleep, he remained a warrior. She wondered what twist of fate had brought them together. A French heiress from New Orleans and a Lakota hunter from the sacred Black Hills. In any other circumstance, they would have moved through life without their paths ever crossing. Now, her survival, perhaps even her sanity, depended on this man who had every reason to despise people of her race. "Thank you," she whispered to his sleeping form, "for believing me when no one else would." Dawn broke with disorienting fog that clung to the low places of the land like phantom lakes. They ate quickly and mounted, Akacheta leading them into the ghostly landscape. The mist provided welcome concealment, but made navigation treacherous. Twice they were forced to backtrack when what appeared to be passable terrain proved otherwise. "Close now," Akacheta announced as the fog began burning away under the midday sun. "Crooked oak beyond next ridge." Elizabeth felt relief tinged with apprehension. After weeks in Akacheta's winter camp and days on the trail, she was about to face other people. People who might recognize her as the missing woman from Fort Remington. People who might be eager to claim whatever bounty Etienne had offered. As they crested the ridge, Crooked Oak Trading Post came into view. It consisted of 3 log buildings arranged around a central yard, with a corral for horses and a smokehouse set slightly apart. A twisted oak tree, from which the post presumably took its name, stood sentinel near the main building, its gnarled branches reaching skyward like supplicating arms. 2 men lounged on the porch of the largest structure, rifles propped casually. Against the wall beside them, they straightened as Akacheta and Elizabeth approached, hands drifting toward their weapons. "That's far enough," called the older of the 2. A grizzled white man with a beard streaked with grey. Akacheta reined his horse to a stop, raising one hand in greeting. "Come in peace. Seek Nathan Two Bears." The men exchanged glances. The younger, dark-haired, with the unmistakable mixed features of someone born to two worlds, gave a slight nod. "Figured you'd show up eventually, Cheta," he said, using a shortened version of Akecheta's name that spoke of familiarity. "Been hearing interesting stories about a Sioux warrior traveling with a white woman." "Nathan," Akecheta acknowledged. "Need to talk. Private." Two bears studied them for a moment longer, then gestured toward a smaller building to the right. "Stable your horses out back. Meet me inside." To his companion he added, "Keep watch, Morris. Don't like the feel of things today." As they dismounted, behind the building, Elizabeth whispered, "Can we trust him?" "Trust no one completely," Akecheta replied pragmatically. "But Nathan owes life debt. Will hear us out." The interior of the small building proved to be Nathan Two Bear's private quarters, a single room containing a bed, table, stove, and storage trunks. Unlike the rough accommodations Elizabeth expected, these quarters showed evidence of refinement. Books lined crude shelves, a decent rug covered part of the floor, and a small landscape painting, surprisingly well executed, hung on one wall. Two bears entered moments after them, closing the door firmly and shooting the bolt. He was younger than Elizabeth had initially thought, perhaps 35, with intelligent eyes that assessed them quickly. "You look like hell, Cheta," he observed, gesturing for them to sit at the table. "And you, ma'am, look remarkably alive for someone reported dead by Sioux attack." Elizabeth tensed. "You know who I am?" Description's been circulating. He poured 3 mugs of coffee from a pot on the stove. "Missing woman from Copper Creek massacre. Only survivor. Head injury that scrambled her wits. Wandered off from Fort Remington." His mouth quirked slightly. "Reward for information. Quite generous. From Colonel Patterson?" she asked. Two Bears shook his head. "Private citizen, Etienne Moreau. Claims to be your cousin and legal guardian." Elizabeth's hands tightened around the mug. "He's the one who scrambled my wits, the one who killed those families." Two Bears showed no surprise at this accusation, merely sipping his coffee and looking to Akecheta. "That's why you're here, to clear Lakota name." "Need information," Akecheta replied. "How many hunters? How close?" 3 men spotted at Davidson's place 2 days back," Two Bears said. "Professional bounty hunters from Kansas City. Nasty reputation. They were asking questions about Sioux winter camps." He glanced at Elizabeth, "and about a blonde woman with green eyes." Akecheta nodded grimly. "As expected." "What about the fort?" Elizabeth pressed. "Are they preparing to move against the Lakota because of what happened at Copper Creek?" Two Bears studied her with new interest. "You're concerned for the people sheltering you." "Interesting." He leaned back in his chair. "Patterson's requested. Reinforcements. Claims hostile Indian activity. Requires swift response. But winter's bought some time. Army moves slow in snow." "We need to tell them the truth," Elizabeth insisted, "before more innocent people die." Two Bears laughed without humor. "Truth's a luxury out here, ma'am, especially when it contradicts what powerful men want to believe." He turned to Akecheta. "What's your plan?" "Get Elizabeth to safety, then deal with cousin." "Deal with," Elizabeth echoed, suddenly uneasy with the implication. Akecheta met her gaze directly. "Men killed entire families to hide crimes. Will not stop hunting you while breathes." His meaning was unmistakable. "I won't be party to murder," she said firmly. "Even his." "Not murder," Akecheta countered. "Justice." Two Bears watched this exchange with calculating eyes. "There's another option," he said slowly. "One that might satisfy both your principles, ma'am, and the practical need to neutralize Moreau's threat." He rose and retrieved a newspaper from a shelf, spreading it on the table. "Territorial judge arrives in Bismarck next week. Man named Hayward. Has reputation for fairness even in Indian matters." He tapped a notice announcing the judge's circuit. "You could petition for hearing, present evidence." "What evidence?" Elizabeth gestured helplessly. My word against his? A head-injured woman who's been living with savages? The hairbrush, Akacheta said unexpectedly, proves you Elizabeth Moreau. And this. He reached into his shirt and withdrew a folded paper, carefully wrapped in oilskin. Found in cabin before we left, hidden under loose board, where prisoners often hide things. Elizabeth took it with trembling hands. Unfolding the paper revealed a letter written in a desperate slanting, "And to any who find this, I, Margaret Wilson, write in fear for my life. Our neighbor, Mr. Etienne Moreau, has imprisoned his cousin Elizabeth against her will. He means to force her to sign over her inheritance. When my husband attempted to help her, Moreau threatened our children. I believe he means to silence us, permanently. If you read this after our deaths, know that Etienne Moreau is responsible, regardless of what tale he tells. May God have mercy on our souls. Margaret Wilson." December 12th, 1876, Elizabeth stared at the letter, emotions warring within her, vindication, grief, horror. "This proves everything. Why didn't you show me before?" "Not sure you ready," Akacheta said simply. "Mind fragile, needed. To remember on own first." Two Bears examined the letter carefully. "This could be enough, especially with your testimony. Judge Hayward isn't easily swayed by money or position." A rifle shot cracked through the air outside, followed by shouting. Two Bears was on his feet instantly, grabbing his rifle from beside the door. "Trouble," he said grimly, peering through a small window. "3 riders armed." He cursed under his breath. "Morris is down." Akacheta moved to Elizabeth's side, drawing his knife. "Bounty hunters. Found trail." "Back door," Two Bears directed, leading them to a narrow exit partially concealed behind a storage trunk. "Leads to the trees. I'll hold them off." "Nathan," Akacheta began. "Life debt works both ways, brother," Two Bears interrupted. "Go, get to Bismarck, find Judge Hayward." He pressed a small leather pouch into Elizabeth's hands. "Money. You'll need it." They slipped through the back door as more shots rang out, crouching low as they made their way to the tree line. Behind them, Two Bears' rifle answered the attackers' fire. Elizabeth clutched the precious letter inside her jacket, heart pounding as they fled into the shelter of the forest. "Our horses!" she gasped as they ran. "No time!" Akacheta replied tersely. "Take theirs later." They moved deeper into the woods, using every tactic Akacheta had taught her for moving silently over frozen ground. The gunfire at the trading post grew more sporadic, then ceased altogether. The silence that followed was somehow more terrifying than the chaos. "Nathan," she whispered as they paused to catch their breath. Akacheta's expression remained stoic, but his eyes betrayed his concern. Strong fighter, smart, maybe create enough confusion for escape. They continued through the woods until dusk began settling around them. With no supplies, no horses, and temperatures dropping rapidly, their situation had become desperately precarious. Elizabeth's brief time among the Lakota had taught her enough to understand the deadly mathematics of winter survival without proper preparation. As darkness fell completely, Akacheta led them to a dense thicket that offered minimal shelter from the wind. "Rest here," he said. "I go back, watch trading post, see if hunters leave, maybe recover horses." "And if they're waiting for exactly that?" Elizabeth challenged. "If it's a trap, no choice. Die slow from cold or fast from bullet." He checked his weapons. "You stay hidden. If not return by dawn, head north. Follow Morning Star." The thought of watching him walk into potential ambush made her chest constrict painfully. There has to be another way. Sometimes only hard paths remain. He met her gaze directly. If die tonight was good death, trying to prevent war, trying to save innocent lives. Elizabeth reached out impulsively, grasping his arm. "You won't die, not after everything we've survived." Something flickered across his scarred features. Surprise, perhaps, or an emotion she couldn't name. He covered her hand with his briefly. "Keep letter safe," he said, "is key to everything." Then he was gone, melting into the darkness with the silent skill that had kept him alive through decades of conflict. Elizabeth huddled against the trunk of a pine tree, pulling her fur-lined jacket tighter around her body. She clutched the precious letter and waited, senses straining for any sound of approaching danger. Hours passed with excruciating slowness. The cold seeped through her layers of clothing, numbing her extremities, despite her best efforts to maintain circulation. Sometime past midnight, snow began falling again, big, lazy flakes that accumulated quickly on the forest floor. Just when she'd begun to fear the worst, a shadow materialized from the darkness. Akecheta knelt beside her, his expression grim but triumphant. "Hunters left," he reported, "following false trail north. Nathan alive, but injured." He helped her to her feet, supporting her weight as her stiffened legs protested. "Have horses, supplies, can reach Bismarck in 4 days if push hard." "And then," she asked, allowing him to guide her through the dark forest. "Then justice," he said simply. "For Wilson family, for Harris family, for my people blamed for crimes not committed." He glanced at her. "And for woman who lost everything but still fights." As they emerged from the trees near where 2 bears had stabled their original mounts, Elizabeth saw their future unfolding before her, dangerous, uncertain, but no longer directionless. The path to Bismarck would be fraught with peril. Etienne's hunters would regroup once they realized they'd followed a false trail. The weather remained a constant threat. And even if they reached Judge Hayward, justice was far from guaranteed. Yet something had fundamentally changed. The fear that had been her constant companion since awakening in the army wagon had transformed into resolute determination. The woman without memory, without family, without safety, had found something perhaps more valuable: purpose. She mounted her horse with newfound confidence, securing the letter that might save both her future and Akecheta's people. As they rode south toward Bismarck and the reckoning that awaited, the snow continued to fall, covering their tracks and offering one final gift of concealment for the journey ahead. Behind them, the lights of Crooked Oak trading posts slowly faded into the darkness. Before them lay uncertainty, danger, and the faint promise of justice. It would have to be enough. The journey to Bismarck tested them beyond any previous hardship. A brutal cold front descended from the north, bringing temperatures that froze breath into ice crystals and numbed exposed skin within minutes. They traveled through the worst of it, wrapped in every layer they possessed, faces covered with scarves, speaking only when necessary to conserve precious warmth. On the second day, they encountered tracks of the bounty hunters, 3 horsemen, moving in a southeastern arc that would eventually intersect their path to Bismarck. Akecheta studied the signs with growing concern. "They realized mistake," he said, crouching beside the hoofprints. "Now guess our destination." Elizabeth felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. "They'll try to cut us off before we reach the judge," he nodded grimly. "Must change route. Take longer path." "We don't have supplies for a journey," she reminded him, inventorying their meager provisions in her mind. "Then hunt," he replied simply. Rising to his feet, he pointed west. "Follow painted hills. More cover. Game still plentiful." The detour added a full day to their journey, forcing them into increasingly rugged terrain where progress slowed to a frustrating crawl. Akecheta proved remarkably skilled at finding game even in the depths of winter, snaring rabbits, shooting a young deer, once even catching fish through the ice of a partially frozen stream. Elizabeth found herself adapting to this harsh existence with surprising facility, her body remembering skills her mind still struggled to place. "You have wilderness in your blood," Akacheta observed, as she efficiently cleaned a rabbit he had caught. Not city woman only. My father took me hunting in Louisiana bayous, she replied, the memory surfacing unexpectedly. Mother hated it, said it wasn't proper for a lady. She smiled faintly at the recollection. Father said proper ladies starve when men aren't around to provide. These fragments of her past continued to emerge, particularly during mundane tasks, when her conscious mind relaxed its desperate search for answers. By the time they reached the outskirts of Bismarck on the afternoon of the 5th day, Elizabeth had assembled a patchwork picture of her former life. Privileged but not idle, educated but practical, sheltered yet possessing an independent streak. That had clearly infuriated her controlling cousin. Bismarck rose before them, a frontier town transformed by the arrival of the Northern Pacific Railroad into a bustling territorial hub. Compared to Fort Remington or Crooked Oak, it seemed enormous to Elizabeth's wilderness-adjusted perceptions. Wooden buildings lined actual streets, horses and wagons created constant movement. Smoke rose from dozens of chimneys, carrying the sense of civilization. Coal fires, cooking food, humanity concentrated in one place. They observed from a wooded ridge south of town, weighing their approach. "Cannot enter together," Akacheta said, stating the obvious. A Sioux warrior accompanying a white woman would draw immediate attention, precisely what they needed to avoid before reaching Judge Hayward. "I could go alone," Elizabeth offered, though the thought of separation sent an unexpected pang through her chest. He shook his head firmly. "Too dangerous. Hunters watch roads, hotels." Then what? Akacheta considered the town below. Wait for dark. Find safe place first, then locate. Judge's quarters without being seen. They made a cold camp on the ridge, eating the last of their provisions, while darkness slowly enveloped the town below. Lights appeared in windows, yellow squares against the gathering gloom. From this distance, Bismarck looked almost welcoming. They prepared for their nighttime infiltration. Elizabeth found herself studying Akacheta's profile in the fading light. The harsh planes of his face had become dear to her in ways she couldn't articulate. His scarred visage, once frightening, now represented safety and integrity. She wondered what would happen after they found Judge Hayward, after her testimony, either condemned or failed to condemn Etienne. Would they simply part ways, each returning to their separate worlds? The thought disturbed her more than she cared to admit. "What will you do?" she asked suddenly. "After this is finished?" He glanced at her, seeming to understand the unspoken aspects of her question. "Return to people, warn of coming trouble, prepare." His expression softened marginally. What will city woman do when justice complete? Elizabeth had asked herself the same question repeatedly during their journey. "I'm not sure there's a place for me anymore. New Orleans feels like another lifetime. And after living in the open," she gestured toward the town below, "walls feel like prisons now." Something like approval flickered in his eyes. Wilderness changes blood. Once tasted, freedom hard to surrender. Full dark finally settled over the landscape. They gathered their most essential belongings, the letter, Elizabeth's hairbrush, weapons, and what little money Nathan had given them. The horses would be too conspicuous in town. They concealed them in a stand of trees with enough rope to graze but not wander. They approached Bismarck from the southeast, using the railroad tracks as a guide. Few people ventured out in the bitter cold of a Dakota winter night, allowing them to slip between buildings with minimal risk of detection. Their first objective was information, locating Judge Hayward without exposing themselves prematurely. The saloon provided what they needed. Akacheta crouched beneath a window while Elizabeth listened to the conversations within. Among discussions of cattle prices and railroad schedules, she caught the information they sought. Judge Hayward had arrived that morning and taken rooms at the Dakota Hotel ahead of tomorrow's court sessions. They located the hotel near the center of town, a 3-story structure with pretensions of grandeur. A crude sign proclaimed, "Dakota Hotel, finest accommodations in the territory." Light spilled from its windows onto the snow-covered street, along with the sounds of a small piano playing in the lobby. "Too public," Akacheta whispered as they observed from an alley across the street. "Too many people." Elizabeth scanned the building, noting a side entrance that likely led to the kitchen or service areas. "There," she said, pointing. "Service entrance, less watched." They circled the block, approaching the hotel from behind. A young man stepped out the back door, lighting a cigarette and stamping his feet against the cold. Elizabeth gestured for Akacheta to remain hidden, then straightened her clothing, pinched color into her cheeks, and stepped into view. "Excuse me?" she called, affecting a slight tremor in her voice. "Could you help me? I've become terribly turned around." The young man nearly dropped his cigarette in surprise. "Ma'am, you shouldn't be out alone at this hour." "I know," she said, moving closer with carefully calculated distress. "I was visiting my aunt on 3rd Street, but I've gotten completely lost. Could you direct me?" As the porter gave directions, pointing up the street, Akacheta slipped silently through the service. Door behind him. Elizabeth thanked the young man profusely, then walked in the direction he'd indicated, circling the block to rejoin Akacheta inside. She found him in a narrow service corridor, pressed against the wall as kitchen staff moved back and forth at the far end. He nodded approvingly at her performance. "Now find Judge's room," he whispered, "without being seen." They moved cautiously through the hotel's back passages, avoiding the main lobby where late-night guests still gathered, a cleaning cart abandoned. In the hallway provided Elizabeth with a master key, which she used to access the hotel register at an unmanned desk on the 2nd floor. "Room 31, she whispered after scanning the book. "3rd floor, north end." They climbed the back stairs to the 3rd floor, encountering no one. The hallway stretched before them, carpeted to muffle footsteps, gas lamps turned low for the night. Room 31 stood at the far end, light visible beneath the door. Elizabeth smoothed her hair, straightened her dress, now woefully inappropriate for a town setting but the best she had, and handed Akacheta both the letter and her hairbrush. "Wait, here," she said. "If anything happens, if anyone raises an alarm, get these to the judge however you can." He gripped her arm briefly. "Be careful. Still don't know if Etienne watches hotel." With a nod of acknowledgement, she walked openly down the hallway and knocked firmly on the door of room 31. A moment of silence, then a man's voice. "Who is it?" "Someone with information about the Copper Creek murders, Your Honor," she replied, keeping her voice low but clear. The door opened to reveal a man in his 60s, still fully dressed despite the late hour. Judge Hayward had the weathered face of someone who'd spent decades listening to humanity's worst impulses and most desperate pleas. He studied Elizabeth with shrewd eyes that missed nothing: her inappropriate dress, her trail-worn appearance, the fading wound at her temple. "You'd better come in," he said after a moment, stepping aside. Elizabeth glanced back toward where Akacheta waited in shadows, giving him a slight nod before entering the judge's room. Judge Hayward's quarters were spartanly furnished but comfortable. Bed, desk, 2 chairs and a small coal stove providing welcome heat. Papers were spread across the desk, suggesting he'd been reviewing cases late into the night. "Sit," he instructed, indicating one of the chairs. He remained standing, maintaining the advantage of height. "Now, what information about Copper Creek could possibly bring a young woman to my door at this hour?" Elizabeth met his gaze directly. "My name is Elizabeth Moreau. According to official reports, I died in an Indian attack at Copper Creek Settlement 5 weeks ago. The judge's expression remained neutral, but his eyes sharpened with interest. "Go on." "There was no Indian attack, Your Honor. The settlers were murdered by my cousin Etienne Moreau, who then burned the cabins to cover his crime and blame the Sioux." Haywood's eyebrows rose slightly. "That's a serious accusation against a respected businessman, Miss Moreau, especially from someone officially declared dead." "I have proof," she said firmly, "and I'm prepared to testify under oath." A knock at the door interrupted them. The judge frowned, moving to answer it. Elizabeth tensed, fearing bounty hunters, or Etienne himself, but it was Akasheta who stood in the hallway, his imposing figure causing the judge to step back involuntarily. "What is the meaning of this?" Haywood demanded, hand moving toward a drawer that likely contained a weapon. "He's with me," Elizabeth said quickly. "He saved my life when I escaped from Copper Creek. Please, let him in. He has the evidence." The judge hesitated, then nodded curtly. Akacheta entered, closing the door behind him. If he felt any trepidation being in a white man's room, a place of tremendous vulnerability for any Indian, he showed no sign of it. "You're Lakota," Haywood observed, studying Akacheta's features. "One of Sitting Bull's people?" "My own man," Akacheta replied with quiet dignity. "Judge known for fairness, even to Indians. Why we came to you." He handed over Margaret Wilson's letter and Elizabeth's hairbrush. The judge examined both, reading the letter twice before looking up. "This is disturbing evidence," he admitted. "But it's not conclusive. A letter that could have been written any time, by anyone. A brush that proves nothing except that you possess it." "I was there," Elizabeth insisted. "I saw Etienne murder the Harris family. He shot Jacob Harris in the back when he tried to help me escape. He set fire to their cabin with Sarah and the children still inside." Her voice broke slightly. "I can still hear their screams." Haywood's expression softened marginally. "I believe you experienced something traumatic, Miss Moreau, but without concrete evidence. The graves," Akacheta interrupted. "Bodies tell truth." The judge frowned. "What do you mean?" "White men shot by Indians take wounds in front," Akacheta explained. "In battle. Harris shot in back. Different weapons too, army rifles different from Etienne's gun." "You're suggesting exhumation," Haywood said slowly. "Examining the bodies to confirm the manner of death." Elizabeth nodded eagerly. "Yes, the evidence is there in the ground." The judge considered this for a long moment. "I have the authority to order exhumation if sufficient cause exists." He tapped the letter. "This might qualify, especially with sworn testimony." He glanced between them. "But you understand what you're asking? This would require a formal inquest, public proceedings. Your cousin would be notified." "He already knows I'm alive," Elizabeth said grimly. "He sent bounty hunters after me. 3 men who nearly killed a friend at Crooked Oak Trading Post. Nathan Two Bears," Akacheta added, "can testify about hunters, about reward offered." Haywood's expression darkened. "Vigilante justice has no place in my territory regardless of who employs it." He paced the small room, thinking, "I'll need detailed statements from both of you. Tomorrow morning, officially recorded by my clerk." A sharp knock interrupted them, 3 rapid strikes against the door that made them all freeze. The judge motioned them to silence, moving cautiously toward the entrance. "Who is it?" he called. "Marshal Davis, Your Honor. Urgent business." Haywood glanced back at Elizabeth and Akacheta, his expression troubled. "Just a moment, Marshal." In a whisper, he added, "The territorial marshal wouldn't come at this hour without serious cause." "Etienne," Elizabeth breathed. "He must have informants watching the hotel." The judge made a swift decision. "Through there," he said, indicating a connecting door to an adjoining room. "Stay silent. I'll handle this." They slipped into the darkened room, leaving the door slightly ajar to hear the conversation. Judge Haywood composed himself, then opened the main door. "Marshal, this is an unusual hour for official business." "Apologies, Your Honor," came a deep voice, "but I've received reports of a fugitive in town, dangerous Sioux warrior traveling, with a white woman, wanted for questioning in the Copper Creek massacre and abduction of a survivor." Elizabeth's heart sank. Their worst fears confirmed. "Indeed?" The judge sounded merely curious. "And you believe this fugitive is in my hotel? Information places them in this vicinity within the hour. I have men searching the building. Wanted to warn you personally, given your scheduled cases involving Indian matters." "Thoughtful of you, Marshal." Haywood's tone revealed nothing. "I'll certainly remain vigilant. Is there a description of these individuals I should know?" As the Marshal described them with disturbing accuracy, Elizabeth exchanged glances with Akecheta in the darkness. They were trapped. The hotel would be watched, the streets patrolled. Even if they escaped this immediate danger, Bismarck had become a cage rather than a sanctuary. The Marshal finally departed after securing the judge's promise to notify him immediately if he saw anything suspicious. Haywood closed the door, waited. Several breaths, then joined them in the adjoining room. "This complicates matters significantly," he said without preamble. "Etienne Moreau clearly has connections with local law enforcement. We can't proceed through normal channels while you're being actively hunted." "What options remain?" Elizabeth asked, dread settling in her stomach. Haywood considered for a moment. "I leave for Fort Abraham Lincoln tomorrow to hear cases there. Army jurisdiction, not territorial. The commander, Colonel Stanton, is a reasonable man who values law above politics." He glanced at Akecheta, "though I cannot guarantee his attitude toward Lakota witnesses." "Must risk it," Akecheta said simply, "for truth." "How do we get there?" Elizabeth pressed. "They're watching the hotel, the roads." "There's a supply wagon leaving for the fort at dawn," Haywood replied, "delivering court documents and provisions. I can arrange for you to be hidden among the cargo." "And tonight?" Akecheta asked practically. The judge pointed to the room they stood in. "My clerk's quarters. He's visiting family. You can remain here until morning." He moved to the window, peering carefully around the curtain. "The Marshal has men positioned at both hotel entrances. You cannot leave without being seen." They had no choice but to accept this precarious shelter. Once arrangements were made for the morning departure, Haywood returned to his own room, leaving them alone in the clerk's quarters. Elizabeth sank onto the edge of the bed, the events of the day catching up with her. "So close," she whispered. "We were so close to justice." "Still are," Akecheta countered, checking the room's window as a potential escape route if needed. "The judge believes, will help if can." She looked up at him, suddenly overwhelmed by all they'd endured together. "Why do you continue to risk everything for me? For this?" He was silent for a long moment, his scarred profile outlined against the faint light from the window. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of deep conviction. "Story told among my people. Great chief asked what measure of man. Some say courage in battle, some say wisdom in counsel. Old grandfather says man measured by what he defends when no one watches, what he protects when no reward comes." He turned to face her. "Truth needs defenders. Always. Especially when powerful men build fortunes on lies." Elizabeth rose and crossed to him, taking his hand in hers, a gesture that would have been unthinkable weeks ago, but now felt as natural as breathing. "Whatever happens tomorrow," she said softly, "I want you to know that finding me in that snowstorm was a gift I can never repay." Something shifted in his expression, the stoic mask momentarily giving way to reveal deeper currents beneath. His fingers tightened around hers briefly before he stepped back, resuming his vigilant watch at the window. "Dawn comes soon," he said, though his voice carried undertones she hadn't heard before. "Should rest while can." As Elizabeth settled onto the clerk's narrow bed, She found herself wondering about the future that awaited beyond tomorrow's danger. For years, her life had followed prescribed paths, the expectations of New Orleans society, then the imprisonment by Etienne, and finally the desperate flight for survival. Now, for the first time, she glimpsed the possibility of choosing her own direction, and increasingly, she found it difficult to imagine any path that didn't include the scarred hunter who had risked everything for truth. Dawn arrived with shuffling, footsteps in the hallway and urgent whispers at the door. Judge Hayward entered quickly, his expression grim. "The supply wagon leaves in 20 minutes, he announced, handing them each a bundle. "Clothing. The Lakota warrior cannot travel as himself." Akacheta unfolded rough work clothes, typical of a laborer: canvas trousers, flannel shirt, worn coat. No traditional Lakota man would willingly abandon his dress, his visible identity. Elizabeth watched him stare at the white man's clothing, understanding the profound sacrifice it represented. "We have no choice," she said softly. He met her eyes, something resolved hardening in his gaze. For truth, for justice. He took the bundle and moved to the corner to change. Elizabeth's package contained a plain dress and shawl, servant's attire that would draw no attention. Judge Hayward tactfully stepped out while they transformed themselves. When Akacheta emerged from the corner, the change was startling. In white man's clothing, with his hair tied back beneath a woolen cap, he appeared almost ordinary, until one noticed the deep scar that no disguise could hide. "Head down," Hayward instructed him. "Cap low, speak to no one." They descended through the service stairs, the judge leading them through the kitchen, where early morning staff barely glanced at what appeared to be two servants following their employer. Outside, a canvas-covered wagon waited in the alley, a bored-looking soldier checking items against a list. "Private," Hayward called, his authoritative tone brooking no argument. "These two are joining the transport to Fort Lincoln. My clerk and his wife. Add them to your manifest." The soldier straightened. "Sir, I wasn't informed. Consider yourself informed now." Hayward handed him a folded document bearing an official seal. "Orders signed by Colonel Stanton himself. These individuals carry sensitive court documents. They are to be delivered directly to the colonel upon arrival." The soldier examined the papers, then nodded reluctantly. "Yes, sir. They'll need to ride in back with the supplies." Precisely as arranged, Hayward turned to Elizabeth and Akacheta. "Remember, speak to no one until you reach Colonel Stanton. The documents you carry explain everything." As they climbed into the wagon, Elizabeth realized the documents were their statements and evidence, prepared by the judge during the night while they slept, their testimony, Margaret Wilson's letter, and the judge's own assessment of their credibility, all officially sealed and addressed to the fort commander. The wagon lurched forward, beginning the 15-mile journey to Fort Abraham Lincoln. Through a gap in the canvas, Elizabeth watched Bismarck recede, wondering if Etienne's hunters were watching, if they'd somehow discerned the judge's strategy. Akacheta sat beside her among crates of supplies, his posture tense with hypervigilance. "Road watched," he murmured. "Feel eyes." Elizabeth nodded, sensing the same danger. "We're exposed. If they stop the wagon." They rode in tense silence for nearly an hour before her fears materialized. Shouts from ahead, then the wagon slowing. Elizabeth peered through the canvas to see 3 mounted men blocking the road. The bounty hunters, unmistakable in their hard-eyed efficiency. "Army business?" the driver called. "Stand aside." "Looking for fugitives," one hunter replied. "Indian and a white woman. Need to check your wagon." Elizabeth's heart hammered against her ribs. Akacheta silently drew his knife, eyes meeting hers. In silent communication, if discovered, they would not be taken without resistance. Footsteps approached the back of the wagon. The canvas rustled as someone reached for the flap. Before it opened, rifle shots cracked through the morning air. Horses whinnied in panic. Men shouted, more gunfire. Then silence. Cautiously, Akacheta pushed the canvas aside. The road ahead, was empty. The bounty hunters had vanished. From the trees along the roadside emerged riders, a Lakota hunting party, rifles still raised. "Hoka-hey," their leader called, a traditional battle cry. Akecheta stiffened in recognition. "Wanbli," he said, "my cousin." The Lakota riders approached the wagon warily, eyeing the nervous soldiers who had drawn their weapons. Wanbli, a man with a face remarkably similar to Akecheta's but unmarred by scars, spoke rapidly in their native tongue. "Wikapi Wind sent us." Akecheta translated for Elizabeth. "Star Woman dreamed of danger, sent warriors to watch road." The standoff between soldiers and Lakota hunters crackled with tension, but the army men were outnumbered and clearly reluctant to start a larger conflict. Their commander made a pragmatic decision. "We continue to the fort," he ordered. "If these gentlemen want to clear the road ahead, we won't object." Wanbli nodded once, understanding the fragile truce. His warriors melted back into the forest, moving parallel to the road, invisible guardians for the remainder of the journey. Fort Abraham Lincoln rose before them near midday, an imposing military installation guarding the Missouri River crossing. As the wagon passed through the gates, Elizabeth felt the weight of what awaited. Here, finally, the truth would either condemn Etienne or be buried forever. Colonel Stanton received them in his office, a tall, austere man with a cavalry officer's rigid posture and assessing gaze. He read Judge Hayward's documents silently, occasionally glancing up to study them. "Extraordinary claims," he said finally, "with potentially serious implications." "True claims," Akecheta replied, meeting the colonel's gaze directly. "Worth dying for." Stanton's eyebrows rose slightly at this boldness. "You realize, sir, that if I order the exhumation Judge Hayward recommends, and the evidence supports your accusations, Etienne Moreau will face capital charges." "Justice demands no less," Elizabeth said firmly. "And if the evidence doesn't support your claims," the colonel's eyes were unreadable, "you've made powerful enemies. The territorial marshal is already demanding your surrender." "I've already lost everything once," Elizabeth replied. "I would lose it again for truth." Something shifted in Stanton's expression. Respect, perhaps, or simply recognition of conviction that matched his soldier's ethos. "Very well," he said, rising. "I'll dispatch men to Copper Creek immediately. The bodies will be examined by the fort surgeon." He paused, his gaze moving between them. "Until then, you'll remain under military protection. Mr. Moreau's influence ends at my gates." That evening, as they stood on the fort's ramparts watching the sunset paint the sky in violent scarlet, Elizabeth found herself at a crossroads she hadn't anticipated. Behind them lay deception, pursuit, and near death. Before them waited justice, and after that, a future undefined. "What comes next?" she asked softly. "When this is finished." Akecheta turned to her, his scarred face softened. "By the fading light, two paths fork. One leads back to white world, inheritance, society, power." He gestured eastward. "Other leads to simpler life, harder in body, easier in spirit." His hand swept toward the western horizon. "And you?" Her question contained multitudes. "My path set. Return to people. Prepare for changes coming." He paused, his next words careful, measured. "But paths sometimes run side by side for many miles." Elizabeth understood the offering contained in those simple words. Not a demand, not even a request, but a possibility. A door left open between worlds. "I've been thinking," she said, watching the last light fade from the sky. "My inheritance could purchase land, protected land, where certain people might live undisturbed by broken treaties and government agents." Akecheta's expression remained controlled, but his eyes betrayed hope. "Bold vision. I learned boldness from a scarred, "Hunter who took me without asking," she replied with a smile, "and gave me back myself in return." As stars appeared overhead, the same stars his people called Wikingpi and her people called Étoiles, Elizabeth made her choice. She reached for his hand, bridging the space between their worlds with a touch that promised neither would walk alone again. In that moment, two broken souls found wholeness in each other's edges, not through grand gestures or passionate declarations, but through the quiet certainty of standing together beneath an indifferent sky that suddenly seemed full of possibility. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.